Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight to our Sailor Series. This is the second to last in the series. Our next lecture is on May 7th with Lloyd McCaffrey, so I hope you all join us for that. A couple of other dates that I wanted to run by you. Just so you all know, we are running a members trip to Porto, Portugal in September. So if anyone's interested in that, Caitlin McCaffrey up at the back of the room is running that trip. So look into that. And our Nautical Antique Show is on May 15th. That's at the beginning of Scrimshaw weekend. So that's a great event with a lot of interesting vendors, so join us for that. And our annual members meeting is on May 29th, and we will also be opening the International Gallery, which is one of the new galleries that's being opened up as a result of building our new Waddles Jacobs Education Center. And that gallery will be dedicated to Caroline and Larry Huntington and Jeannie and Don Rice, who are with us tonight. So it's going to be a gorgeous exhibition and a great new space. So please join us for that. So I'm here to introduce Michael Dyer, who will introduce our speaker tonight, Michael Pappalardo. But I just wanted to tell a quick funny story about when I first met Michael and his mother Jane and his wife and his family. And Michael has 8 kids, ranging from about 22, I think, down to about 2 years old. And we took them around the museum for a tour, and if any of you have ever been on the James Russell tour, you know it goes for about 2 hours. And the kids were so well behaved, so nice the entire time, and I had a 2-year-old at the time and kept looking at this 2-year-old thinking, how is this kid being this good this entire time? Didn't say a peep. And all of a sudden, after 2 hours, she looked at her mother and said, "Mommy, I want to go home now." So we all thought she deserved to go home. It was time to take a nap, but we just had a great time getting to know the Pappalardos, and that's how this, the idea for his speech here got started. So thanks, Michael, for being here, and our maritime historian, Michael Dyer, will introduce Michael Pappalardo.
Well, good evening, folks. You know, I can't miss an opportunity to yammer on a bit about maritime history, being a maritime historian and all. So, a few prefatory remarks before introducing our speaker this evening. For all the powerful momentum of westward expansion, antebellum America remained, nonetheless, a maritime nation. Seaports were the centers of cash and culture, and shipbuilding enabled colonial commerce to flourish, and later for American naval power to be proven all around the world. While it should come as no surprise to us that periodically the physical evidence of that era should manifest itself in large-scale remains or ruins of one type or another, we remain nonetheless fascinated when it happens. A few years back, for instance, a set of timbers, evidently from a vessel the size of a late 18th century sloop, were discovered buried in the mud up in the upper Acushnet River here in New Bedford. From these remains, the keel was determined to be made of hickory timber, which was a very interesting fact indeed. For all of its strength, hickory is prone to rot quickly in contact with the ground. However, many kinds of timber can remain sound when submerged in an anaerobic environment or submerged under the water. The London Bridge is a great example where the elm timbers were set in 1176 and remained intact until 1830 when the bridge was renovated. Harbor cleanup crews here often drag up iron anchors off the bottom of the Acushnet River, and I'd be more surprised if we didn't see such artifacts. After all, these are the detritus of a once dominant maritime culture. To build ships, shipbuilders needed great oak timbers, so when the construction workers excavated the foundations of the new Spaulding Rehabilitation Center in Boston in 2011 on the site of the 19th century Charlestown Navy Yard. They uncovered these great balks of white oak and live oak that were buried in the mud and found it to be solid and in stable condition, which is gratifying but not particularly an astonishing revelation for those familiar with shipbuilding timbers. The astonishing revelation came when Mystic Seaport, during the restoration of the Charles W. Morgan, found itself short of shipbuilding timbers of those exact dimensions, and were able to take these timbers that had come out of the mud of the Charlestown Navy Yard and use it to renovate the Charles W. Morgan. They were perfect for the job. But tonight we'll hear another tale from another city of another set of buried timbers and what exactly the world can learn from the methodology of archaeology when applied to a maritime site. Tonight's speaker, Michael Pappalardo, is a senior technical director at the firm of AKRF, an environmental planning and engineering firm based in New York City. He has over 25 years of experience in cultural resource management, working in the context of federal, state, and local preservation laws for a wide variety of public and private clients. He has directed numerous large and small-scale research projects from the state of Maine to the Mojave Desert, ranging from small prehistoric campsites through large 19th century industrial sites. Throughout his career, Michael has had an interest in the efficient integration of technology into his field efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give a warm round of applause and a welcome to Michael Pappalardo.
Thank you, Michael, for that very nice introduction. Just to temper your expectations, I'm not an underwater archaeologist, and until not too long after we found the ship, I thought that an underwater archaeologist was one who was a little bit behind in their mortgage payments. And else, in the next 2 hours after we left here, were quite the opposite of that experience. So, anyway, thank you for coming. This is quite an honor in this beautiful facility, and I'm very happy to be here with you. Just a quick background, I'll talk about what the work entailed, what we found, and then some of the research that we did. In the years following the 9/11 tragedy, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey mounted a massive rebuilding effort of Lower Manhattan. AKRF, the company that I work for, was in charge of the environmental planning for that project. A lot of things were involved in that planning. One of them was the construction of an underground parking facility down here, which is just below the footprints of where the World Trade Center once stood. As they planned to construct this large-scale underground parking garage, the company that I work for was hired to do a documentary study of the area, what type of potential resources might be involved. Now, this is Manhattan. This is a map that was made in 1865, and it shows the coastline as it stood in 1865. This map also shows what the coastline of Manhattan looked like originally before they built it out into the Hudson River, which is along the west side of Manhattan, and the East River on the east side. This star shows where this underground parking garage was going to be constructed. And you can see that it's well off the coastline. This is the coastline at the time, and the star shows that it's out in land. Whoops, I think I just went backwards. Did I go backwards? I went forwards. So this is an aerial photograph of the same area, and the VSC site was going to be located in a portion of Manhattan that was made of landfill. As we did this research, what we were interested in was the type of timber objects, crib-like objects that were used as they expanded Manhattan. Boston went through the same experience. They would build large, sort of like log cabin type structures to contain fill material as they lowered the hills of Manhattan. They would take that extra landmass, put it into these cell-like, crib-like structures, sink it out into the wharfs. They'd build bulkheads, they'd build piers, they'd create slips, and as Manhattan grew, the land was filled in. And this is an interesting archaeological issue, and it's what we identified this site as being sensitive for. In order to build this underground parking garage, it's going to be, it's in an area that was a landfill. The sea level, the water table is quite shallow, and the World Trade Center site is up on the top of this slide. The first thing that we're going to do was construct a slurry wall from the existing grade down and lock it into the bedrock, which is something between 30 and 50 feet below the current grade. This is a picture of the western part of this slurry wall. They're going to construct the slurry wall, and then once they keep the water, create a bathtub to keep the New York Harbor from entering the site, excavate the material in the interior portion in order to facilitate construction. So because of the sensitivity for landfill retaining objects, we were monitoring during the construction of this slurry wall. This is a series of photographs showing how they would do it. This is a giant clamshell type crane. It would reach down into the earth, pull up material, and drop it. So we were there monitoring that, and you can see off on the right, sometimes this clamshell would pull up large timbers, perfectly preserved. Michael explained this is an underwater submerged area covered in soil. It's anaerobic, so the wood was remarkably well preserved. They found also the rock that would sometimes be used to weigh these crib-like structures and sink them to the river bottom. And they found quite a bit of this material. This is just in the construction of the slurry wall. So we having determined that it's very sensitive for these not so interesting landfill retaining objects, we did recommend that during the excavation of the entire interior of that block, archaeologists once again be present, and you can see the scattered timbers all around as this would proceed. So they created the slurry wall, they were lowering the water table, and then a whole series of excavators were removing the soil down to bedrock to build the underground parking garage from the bedrock up. And we were there, and during this monitoring, we did in fact find intact crib-like structures. You can see how it's built sort of like a log cabin with perpendicular timbers. Sometimes they were notched. They had sometimes intricate, what's the word I'm thinking of? Intricate? Stumbling on that one. Clever ways of locking these devices together. This is one you can see there's a vertical post that locks in both the series of horizontal timbers, crudely constructed, but we had long days of monitoring. We found these all over the place, and as we were struggling amongst all of the excavators, it was difficult to document them, so sometimes we'd stay pretty late into the evening. So this photograph was of a feature I excavated at 6:30 at night. Next morning, we wanted to more carefully excavate it, but it was this big hole back there. There was a lot of pressure to continue the operation. So the next morning, we were monitoring not too far from that, and this is an archaeologist off to the right side of this photograph. And then this curved piece of wood came out, which wasn't quite like the timber features we've been finding. It turns out it was something called a futtock, which I didn't have any idea what it was at the time, but it's part of a ship. We did a little more clearing, and we found another one still in place. And so what the elevation we're at now is about 20 to 30 feet below the existing grade, and it was about where the river bottom would have been during the 18th century. A little more clearing, you can see that we're beginning to uncover the hull. And this is all the very first day. And if you ever want to find a ship, you should probably pick a day when nothing else is happening in the whole world, apparently. Got a lot of attention. Press showed up, we got to be on TV, and we were visited by celebrities as well. This is my mother, by the way. So after the initial excitement of finding it, there was a lot of planning and discussions on how to go about and what to do. So initially we used the machines that were excavating the site to help remove there were several feet of dense, heavy clay on top of the ship. So we used the machine, we used hand excavation, shovels, etc., to expose the ship. It was the middle of summer. We had to keep it, when it wasn't raining, we had to keep using water to keep it wet. And this is the first week we finally got it completely uncovered, doing some initial documentation with hand equipment, making some drawings. We also had an outfit come to the site using a 3D laser technology to get a very accurate three-dimensional model of the ship as it was found in the ground. And we think maybe these are the ghosts of the people that were once on the ship. This is a cloud of points, and each one has XYZ coordinates, so it's essentially a CAD image. And we put together a team of archaeologists. There's several here. We've got some ship experts. This is Dr. Warren Reese and Carrie Atkins-Fulton. Warren is from the University of Maine, and Carrie is from Cornell. We had preservationists, we had a photographer, an illustrator, and then a bunch of crew members from AKRF. And we had a week to document and remove the ship in the middle of this still active construction site where there were cranes and bulldozers and excavators. And so I'll quickly go through a few slides showing the process of documenting it. Here we see Warren and Carrie. They are individually, each timber, they're putting a label with a staple gun, labeling it, recording, it's describing it, making sketches of it, photographing, videotaping, and measuring. And this, what we see here is this is the top image is a longitudinal cross-section of the ship to show you what we sort of had. What we found was the bottom half of the stern of the hull. And it was positioned along the river bottom, so with the back end of it, lower elevation than the front. Everything above this point had probably rotted away. So all that was left was the part that's shown here. We have the keel, a bunch of frames, the outer hull, and the inner hull. And there's diagrams on the bottom show you this series of 3 layers, the outer planks and the keel, the frames and futtocks, which gave it its strength and shape, and then portions of the inner hull, which are called the sealing planks, and a keelson. So each piece was individually documented, photographed, and then we had to remove it. And the process of removing each piece required, we used rubber mallets and wooden wedges. Although it had been under the ground for quite a while, it was still, the wood had great integrity, and they attached these pieces together with large nails and spikes, and it was actually quite difficult to wrench each piece apart. Required teams working hard with hammers, etc. And then we would remove each piece one by one, carefully. And this is showing at night we had this big tarp stretched over the top of it to keep the sun off of it, but we had to work long hours, sometimes 16 hours a day. And they wouldn't let us leave the pit, so occasionally, being in New York City, we'd have pizzas delivered, lowered down into the pit. So up there, that's the ground surface, and the initial, then about this would have been the top of the Hudson River, and this is the river bottom at this depth. So you can see the distance below ground where we were working. At each step of the removal process, we brought that 3D laser scan back out to the site. At the top image, we can see once we removed the sealing layer and the small deck called an orlop deck, which was back here, we exposed all of the frames and did a 3D scan. And then the bottom image is once all of the frames and the keelson removed, we see the outer hull, the keel, and the stern knee. And these are 2 photographs showing the same 2 steps from a different angle. So you can see as we've excavated around it, we left it on a pedestal. So this would have been well below the Hudson River's bottom. But this was originally resting on the Hudson River, the river bottom. And you can see it's pitched slightly upwards towards the east, inland. And on this image, you can see some of the spikes still poking up that kept the whole entire thing together. And now we've removed the outer hull, and we're exposing this giant stern knee. That object weighed about 500 pounds. It took 6 of us with boards across our shoulders and straps to get it. And this is the stern post, and an artist's rendition on the right. The rudder would have attached off to the right of this image. As each piece was removed from the ship itself, it was wrapped in a special type of material to keep it moist, sealed in plastic, loaded into these giant containers. It took 2 of these containers. There were several hundred pieces of the ship put onto tractor trailers and initially shipped down to Maryland, where they have a special lab to take care of objects like this. And then, after about 6 months, it was then brought down to Texas, where they have one of the best labs in the country to deal with this type of material. During the course of excavating the ship, once we removed the sealing layer, we found in between all of the frames and futtocks mud, and it was basically sealed in that location. So it was the best opportunity we had to collect the artifacts that might have been associated with the use and operation of the ship. So all of that muck that was located in between these frames, sealed in between the layers of the ship, were put into buckets, and we water screened it there, and we collect large quantities of soil samples which were submitted for flotation, where they put the soil through very, very finely graded mesh for fine artifacts. And we found lots of artifacts. We found many thousands of artifacts, munitions, several different types of munitions, from birdshot and buckshot. This is a cannonball as well, a French-designed cannonball. Lots and lots of faunal and floral materials, seeds and pits and nuts and all kinds of animal bone. There's a picture of the sole of a shoe here. The problem was trying to differentiate the artifacts that were simply ended up in this fill, this 20 feet of fill put on top of the ship, from the artifacts that got dumped into the slip. When this ship got to where it was discovered, it was an open slip. So boats would come in from the Hudson River, load and unload, and then stuff would fall into the slip or get thrown into the slip. And then finally, the artifacts that were associated with the people that worked on this ship or the cargo that might have been used to transport. We used a variety of simple statistical measures to try to winnow out what types of artifacts were which. This is a button that's embossed with the number 52. It was worn by someone from the British 52nd Regiment of Foot. They fought against the Americans in the Battle of 1775, and they lost. We found that button in the ship, and it probably doesn't necessarily mean that the British were using this ship. They occupied Manhattan during the Revolutionary War because these buttons had some value, and it might have been reattached to someone else's outfit. So we don't really know if that's indicative of the British using the ship. But it was an interesting find. So we had all of this artifacts, all of these pieces of wood. We had lots and lots of other samples, and we did a lot of research efforts. A lot of experts were brought on. We had experts in every one of the different artifact classes, from the botanical remains and the faunal remains to the bricks we found on the orlop deck, which might have been some sort of a hearth, tree species identifier. We did dendrochronology, and I'll touch on a few of these topics. Historic research was very important. The bottom image shows what Manhattan would have looked like from New York Harbor. Our site is over here on the left side of it. This image here is the coastline of Manhattan at about 1766. The red dot, where's my pointer? That small red dot is the location of where we found the ship. So it looks like, kind of matches that dock that extended out from the coastline pretty closely. So that's what Manhattan looked like in 1766. By 1797, this green line is showing what the coastline looked like at that period, a few decades later. So at some point in that period of time, Manhattan had been filled in as it grew westward out into the Hudson. This was one of the ways that Manhattan raised revenue, was by selling the rights to develop the coastline, and you were obligated to establish streets, etc. Each of the pieces of the ship was photographed using something like photogrammetry and digitized, and the top image is showing where nails were located to try to figure out exactly how the pieces were attached. Some pieces had been recycled from an earlier ship, and this was all quite complicated. It was photographed. We did some comparative analysis to see what type of ship it might have been. And by saying we, I didn't have anything to do with this. This was just other experts on the crew. It looked like we had something more like the hull on the bottom, a wide, flat hull. And they determined that it's something like a Hudson River sloop. This was a ship type that became standardized in the early 1800s. But our ship was probably built earlier than that, at a time when there was more variability, but it had a wide, flat hull for the relatively shallow waters of rivers like the Hudson River. The weathering we saw on the keel showed that it had been dragged ashore and pushed back out into the water repeatedly, so it was very weathered, very battered. And it was designed for cargo or people or passengers or something like that, as opposed to speed. The ship on the right is a depiction of a Hudson River sloop. The hull itself had the tarry-like substance attached to it, the outer hull, and in that tarry substance there was quantities of human hair, and on one of the human hairs there was actually a louse, a species of louse that's followed humans along. And the ship itself had other parasites. Some of the timbers were badly damaged by a type of a mollusk known as a shipworm. This particular species evidently only survives in the warmer salt waters of the Caribbean, so it suggests that the ship at some point or another made a trip to the Caribbean. But it was very, very damaged, and probably by the time it got to Manhattan, it might not have been very seaworthy. These wouldn't have been a species of animal that would have continued to live in the waters of Manhattan. Dendrochronology is the process of looking at the rings of wood, and each tree in a normal year puts a new ring, develops a new growth ring. They're a particular region, all of the trees in that particular region grow at the same rate, so they've created indexes that show these growths. So when they looked at the timbers of the World Trade Center ship, and they were able to determine actually where the trees that it was made from grew, a small area outside of Philadelphia, and also about when those trees started growing and when they were felled. There are some limitations to dendrochronology. You need to have at least 100 rings to get a statistically significant match with these indexes. Many of the samples we took didn't have enough rings. Other timbers had been squared, so we didn't have the outermost rings. And some were poorly preserved. But a bunch of them were perfect samples. So we actually have a very firm idea of when this ship, where it was made, and about when it was made, or at least when the trees it was made from. And it puts it sometime in the early 1770s. So I'll do a quick summary of some of the more interesting things about the discovery. This was one of only a dozen or so colonial-era merchant ships that were professionally documented. This, as far as I'm aware, is the first time that dendrochronology has been used for a New World ship to determine exactly when and where it was made. This happens in Europe all the time, but it hasn't until this time in America. It was built sometime around the early 1770s outside of Philadelphia. One of the planks in particular started growing sometime before 1494. It's kind of interesting. Many of the timbers probably came from, or several at least, came from an earlier vessel. We can determine this because the nails didn't quite match the wood underlying them. So maybe they were pried up and they left the nails in it and integrated it into this ship. Wide, beamy hull, probably used for a riverine type of environment. We found all kinds of artifacts that probably were related to the people that worked on the ship or passengers on the ship or the cargo. Not as much as we would have liked. Other ships go down with their entire cargo still on it, but we didn't have that. Our ship sunk, and the upper portions of it eroded away, but fortunately it was buried soon after it sank, and we were at least able to preserve the bottom part of the hull. It probably sat at the river bottom for a few years before it was buried, though. We found large, mature oysters attached to it, and it wouldn't have been sailing around with oysters on it, so that was one indication of how long it had been exposed to the water. We found various types of seagrass had begun to colonize it, and the estuarine environment of New York Harbor in this particular area, it started to habitate this remains. So all of those remains below the ship, inside of the ship, and on the ship were able to help us determine that this kind of sequence of events that occurred. And then a few weeks ago, we had a new fun fact. The Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, who is the organization that hired us to excavate and document the ship, they've decided to preserve the wood remains, which are now just sitting in water down in Texas, and they're going to preserve it. It's going to take 5 years. They're going to soak each of the timbers in polyethylene glycol, or PEG, to preserve it. They've got a very large freeze-drying apparatus, the largest one in North America, and they're going to freeze-dry each of the timbers, reconstruct it, or first bring it up to the New York State Museum in Albany and reconstruct it and put it in display. This is an example of other museums that have displayed ships. So the World Trade Center ship was built somewhere in Philadelphia. It made its way up to Manhattan. It went up and down the Hudson River, probably down to the Caribbean, languished for a couple hundred years at the bottom, buried as New York City grew up around it. We shipped it to Maryland, then to Texas, and it's going to make one more trip back to Albany, where it'll hopefully be there for all you guys to visit. Probably not for 5 or so years, but that's it. Any questions? Yes.
When you said that you had a week to excavate it, do you feel that you got it all? Do you think anything was still left, or are we confident that everything that was to be found?
Well, we had just the bottom of the ship. The upper portions weren't there. We didn't. The excavators didn't destroy it. It probably had washed away a long time ago. I guess I didn't mention this, but the bow of the ship we found a year later on the other side of the slurry wall they constructed. They boxed in our site, excavated it, and we found the ship, and then a year later did the next lot to the east. And we found a little bit of like a 6-foot by 6-foot portion of the bow. The remains in this huge city block were endless. We collected during that 2-year monitoring effort before we found the ship, we found so much stuff, and it was just a sampling. We could just sample it. But as far as the ship goes, I think we collected pretty much everything we could possibly collect. Yeah.
Were you able to determine overall length of the vessel?
Yeah. So from the stern post to the stem post, which we had both of those objects, it was a distance of about 40 feet, and I think they measured the lengths of ships different ways. So if we had the upper deck, there would have been an upper deck at some point. It probably would have been a little bit longer. So something like 40 to 45 feet. So it's a relatively small ship. We only found a 32-foot portion of the stern, and then a 6-foot chunk of the bow, 10 feet away from it.
One other question. All those logs you dug up, case beats, whatever, what did you do with half of that wood?
What did we do with that wood? That 30-foot by no, they disposed of all of that wood. We collected samples with a chainsaw. We found 2 or 3 dozen timber landfilling features, and we would be given a few hours to clean them off, photograph them, take a slice of wood, and we submitted all those samples for dendrochronology. And as you go from east to west, from close to the original shoreline of Manhattan out to the western edge of our project site, the dates progress, so you can sort of see the progression of development, which closely mapped the historic research. But we just collected samples of it. I mean, the volume of wood was tremendous. Do you mean to use it for other types of construction? Right, yeah. You can imagine that would be really interesting. As Michael mentioned, reusing wood for, but I think it was all disposed of. And it had creosote. Some of it was treated with, so that was an issue of whether it was an environmental hazard to bury it. But I really don't know what happened to it. I have a big chunk in my closet.
That's good. Yes, hi. I'm asking this. I'm Lori Robertson-Laurent. I'm biographer of Herman Melville. And I'm interested in anything you found related to the residential artifacts and so forth from that area, because Melville lived on Cortlandt Street when he, at one point as a child, very near the docks. And so that, about on the footprint of the World Trade Center. And I'm wondering, I want to learn more about the excavations and where some of that material is and what you might have found that was indicative of life in the mid-1820s.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I wish we had been able to treat this entire construction site, an active construction site, as we would a normal archaeological site. But we unfortunately weren't able to. We simply had a relatively small crew, and we would kind of move around strategically when there wasn't a giant machine digging giant holes, collect artifacts, make some notes about where it was located, the depth, and its location. And so to answer your question, though, we found a wide variety of artifacts that are related to the commercial activity that occurred in this area. This was the waterfront. People lived there, but it was a very active commercial area. We would find in certain small areas a dozen bottles, almost identical bottles, still sealed, some broken, but it looked as if a box of that product had just fallen in when they were unloading a ship. We found lots and lots of animal horns, which they would process and use for various purposes. Butcheries would dump their remains. The slip was really a place to dispose of garbage. We also found hundreds of pipe stems, tobacco pipe stems. So those are probably people walking along the dock and just flicking their break off the pipe stem and throw it in. We didn't find anything that old. Well, they were used straight through the 1800s, and now they have E-pipes. But we didn't find anything that's as old as anything that was Dutch to that time period. And it's almost impossible because of how we salvaged artifacts to really know if it was domestic, something of a particular residence. When we work on a project in Manhattan or Brooklyn, right now I'm working in Brooklyn, we know who lived in that house for every 10-year period of time, and because deed research, and we can look in their backyard and really make that strong correlation. But this was an open body of water, not the same context.
Do you use like a surrogate to find the objects? Do you use like computers or anything? Like how people use them?
Like ground penetrating radar?
Sort of, yeah.
Or a metal detector?
Yeah, like something along that line, like they, computerized.
For this project, we call it, the technical term is a bright and shiny surveying strategy. You could really see it in the mud, we'd run over and grab it. So it was totally, there's The only thing that was very high, technology was that 3D laser device, but if we could have used that throughout the whole process, we would have been able to have great maps of all of these timbers and bulkheads and wharfs. But not for this. No remote sensing. It was a salvage type operation. Yes.
I'm curious, does the wood all, was it all preserved consistently? I mean, does a toxin in the water or something affect how wood would be preserved?
This.
Did you see any evidence of there being patterns or something in the wood?
What was the last word?
Being buried underground?
Well, like Michael explained in his introduction, this was an anaerobic environment, so there was no air whatsoever. So the same types of organisms that would break down a wood, a branch laying in a forest, weren't able to function. So I think preservation was the wood was, some of the pieces of wood were in the same condition that they would have been back in the 1770s. And the water itself, they were wet, but I don't believe there's any kind of toxic type, from the pollutions in New York Harbor. No, I don't think so. The air once we expose it to the air, that was where it was, the assaults of dehydration and the sun and our trampling all over this thing as we're trying to pull it apart. You're going to charge me for that?
Just to keep it wet while you're,
Yeah.
to preserve it.
Yes. Yeah. And for the last several years, it's been kept underwater to keep it in that same situation.
I guess from the history of development and redevelopment in Manhattan, how unique is this find as far as are there other areas where ships of that area have been found, or is this a one of a kind find?
It's not a one of a kind. There was another ship found to the east on the East River back in the 1980s, and Warren Reese, who was our expert, he was the one that directed that project as well. So we found a ship. We called Warren, and he was happy to come down. There are a finite number of other ship parts that have been found. The South Street Seaport Museum was constructed coincidentally on a ship. They were doing some routine maintenance outside, and they got an image of it, but they're not going to excavate it simply because it's below a building. So it's one of two or three in Manhattan. But they've been there's so many shipwreck discoveries all across America, but very, very few of them end up being actually documented and removed. It's a very expensive process, and there's not much to do with it.
Did you watch the site being clawed at by the big machinery as you left?
Well, we were working with these machines the whole time. So as it went from street grade down, we were there, at over 25 feet of excavation. I mean, millions of cubic yards of soil were removed. But the worst was when you see this beautiful crib-like structure destroyed minutes after you've taken a photograph. But they didn't stop excavation the whole time we were there. Even when we found the ship, they were working around us and gave us only a week to pull it out. It was a long week.
Your site specifically was gone within, day after you got out of it?
Yes, that same day. I mean, the project was so behind schedule already when we started working there, through all kinds of political and financial reasons, that there was huge pressure not to slow things down.
Are there no paper records of any sunken ships that would give you an idea of what it was?
Oh, that's a great question. So we spent a considerable amount of time trying to find that. As these water lots, that's what they were called, the extension of a person's property that's extended out into the Hudson River, as they would be bought and sold, there'd be ads in the paper selling a water lot. This is where it's located, these are its dimensions, these are its features. And every so often they would say things like, there's a hull, submerged hull there, or there'd be ads for someone to come and remove a hull. So we looked quite diligently for that and weren't able to find any record of this particular sunken ship. We did find the people that owned these water lots and traced their history, but no mention in the, we couldn't actually find the deeds. We found the owners, but there's lots of repositories that we didn't get a chance to look at, but we did make a good effort.
This gentleman has a question right here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I was curious. I don't remember if you said that there was an approximate date the boat had been built.
What we do know is that several of the timbers it was made from were felled in the early 1770s. So we know that. We know that it was a very worn and weathered ship, and we know that it was buried under landfill by the early 1790s. So it had to have been built sometime between the early 1770s and the early 1790s when it was buried, and because it was so weathered, I think it was probably built in the early 1770s.
And did you find anything interesting about the manner in which the planking was secured to the frames and ribs?
It was used a lot of nails at a time when, I forget the name of the wooden, does anyone know the trunnels? At a time when trunnels were very popular, this ship was constructed primarily of nails and spikes. So that was one interesting component of its construction, because metal was expensive at the time. It was, one of our ship experts did a recreation of how it had to have been assembled from the keel as the outer planks were fitted into the rabbet on each side of the keel, because of the nail placement, how it was constructed from the base outwards, which I understand is somewhat unique for this particular ship. But each ship was, there's a lot of vernacular aspects to ship design at this point in time. So I think each ship is somewhat unique from the colonial era.
So I assume that the metal fastenings were pushed through the frame and the rib and bent over on both sides.
As they extended outwards? No, that wasn't the case. We didn't see them. They didn't extend outwards through the outer hull, if that's what you're asking. They extended, I think the heads of them would be from the outer hull upwards, the heads of the spikes. But that's something that's simply beyond my level of understanding of ship construction. No, iron. Well, they varied in size. They weren't all the same, but they'd range between around 4 inches to a little bit bigger. 4 by 4. They were square. Yes.
What was the depth of the keel, do you remember?
The size of the keel?
Yeah.
I think it was something like 4 inches by 4 inches as well. Yeah, and it wasn't a very robust ship. So I think it was built to get the job done and not to last a long time.
And no
Very.
iron furniture, like chains or any iron furniture that would have been available?
We found an anchor on the river bottom, but it was some distance away, so it could have been from any ship. No, we found an orlop deck, a very small orlop deck, and on that a ring of iron, which might have been a hearth, and it was somewhat mortared to a series of bricks in the area. So maybe there was a brick hearth on this orlop deck, which was used to keep the place warm or cook food. But nothing else. We found lots of trunnels and the nails, artifacts, but no other.
That's a good indication that a lot of that stuff was salvaged.
Yes, I understand that there probably would have been salvaged. Before it sank, it was probably stripped of anything reusable.
I have read that a lot of times when they're filling harbors, Boston, New York, all these places where, where they're making land, is that they used to take old ships and load them in a place where it was easy to get filled, fill it almost to the gunnels, and then float it over to the place and then add some more junk and then sink it to build it up. It was a cheap way to get a lot of fill to remote places. When you think about getting fill in New York, once they leveled all that they could level, they had to bring that with horses and wagons
Yeah.
from a long distance to be able to dump it in. So I read that was very common. They have some of these things are filled in. Lots of ship hulls are buried all over the place.
Well, the one on eastern Manhattan that Warren Reese excavated back in the 80s, that was integrated into the landfill. So the walls themselves came out and met the ship. And so our ship wasn't like that. It was in the middle of the bulkheads. Yeah, just,
Sank at an angle or whatever, just
yeah,
they left it there.
yeah, yeah. Anything else? Yes.
So it was sent to Texas, is that what?
Yes, Texas A&M, yeah.
And is that where it is now?
Right now, it's there. It's in a whole series of containers in water. And after the LMDC, that's the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, announced their decision to preserve and reconstruct it, they're going to start to soak them in a solution of PEG, this polyethylene glycol material. It's going to replace the organic cell structure of the wood. Over time, it might take that giant 500-pound sterny, that might take 5 years to be properly processed. Put them into the freeze dryer, and over extended periods of time, freeze the moisture out, and what you're left with is something of the same structure as the original piece of wood. And they'll take our 3D laser images and all of the other survey data we collected and notes and put it back together. And it's going to be, I can't even imagine how that'll occur. And then the State Museum will decide if they want to add fake material, to give viewers to the museum a sense of what it might have looked like. Because now it's not much to look at. It's relatively flat, about the area of this floor here, and I don't know. So that's more of a museum decision. But I understand that the wood, once it's preserved this way, is only a fraction of its current weight. It's quite light. Yeah.
Is this likely to be made into a video of some sort that we might be able to see at a later date?
Are you a producer? Asked if you're a producer. No, I don't know. I mean, we talked to a bunch of different people that wanted to do something, and I've got lots of video. Maybe I'll do something at some point. I did try to document it because I sensed this was something it's not going to happen too often in my life, if ever again. So we tried to document it as best we could during the process of the excavation.